Now for the bedtime story about what happens to little middies who forget to duck.
As you know, gentlemen, the recitation this morning touches upon responsibilities of a commanding officer. In time of stress and crisis, the conduct of the commanding officer is the difference between salvation and disaster. I'm reminded of the story of an officer, I regret to say a graduate of this academy, who ruined a brilliant career by one lapse from the straight path of duty. Shortly after the war, this officer was in command of a destroyer attached to the fleet. One night, returning from maneuvers, they were running along a treacherous stretch of coast. He had gone to his cabin. On the bridge, the navigator pored over his charts. Suddenly, this officer appeared. He was unsteady on his feet. He ordered immediate change of course. A few minutes later, the ship piled up on a reef. Only the greatest coordination and discipline prevented the loss of every life aboard. The navigator was among those killed, but this officer survived the disaster and was tried by court-martial. He stubbornly refused to offer the slightest defense. He was convicted, and his name stricken from the rolls of the Navy. There is one very good rule of seamanship, which is really the moral of this story. And that is, up anchor, down court.
Just a minute, sir. If you're insinuating that officer was drunk on duty, it's a lie.
Did I hear you distinctly, Mr. Cross?
You heard me quite distinctly, sir. I said that your story is a lie. Well, this may mean my dismissal, but I'm going to tell you the real story. During the war, that officer whose story you just told spent 26 days at a time on patrol in the North Sea. He did that for nearly 2 years. He was the kind of an officer who would labor in the engine room with cranky engines, who would navigate, sleep on a cot on his bridge. The kind of an officer who would forget to be sick or tired or hungry, who would forget everything, except that he has a duty to perform. Once, after his destroyer had been sunk by a torpedo, he spent 16 hours in icy waters because the 2 remaining lifeboats were filled with survivors. He was wounded, but he refused to tell anyone because he was afraid they might take him to the hospital. Then after the war, he came back to this country. He did have the command you mentioned. And then he began to have terrific headaches and chills and fever, but he fought them off. He had a racked, overworked, overstrained body, but he didn't tell anybody because he felt that the Navy needed him to do a job. He was in his cabin that night, after 20 straight hours on the bridge, but he couldn't rest. His seaman's instinct told him that his ship was running into danger, so he made his way back to the bridge and took over. He found that the navigator was way off his course and heading inshore. He tried his best to put her about, but it was too late. They piled up. So he was tried by court-martial. But he wouldn't defend himself because the blame would have fallen on the navigator, and the navigator was dead. So he took the blame, and they dismissed him from the service. When they threw him out, he didn't complain of his broken body. He didn't moan because he got no retired pay. And he had nothing, hardly enough to eat. But instead, he sat nights telling his son stories of the Navy. Trying to teach his son to love the service the way he loved it.
You seem to be quite an authority on the career of this officer, Mr. Cross.
Yes, sir, I should be, sir. My full name is John Cross Carter. The officer of your story is Commander Carter, my father.